In station 1, we have 2 glass tubes. We have one that is larger in diameter, and then there is a second one that is small in diameter. That's a pretty tiny tube there. And what we're doing is we are putting them both into this beaker of colored water. It's just water with blue food coloring so we can see it more easily. And what you should notice when these tubes are side by side is notice how in that tiny tube the liquid, zoom in on that, the liquid is going up higher in that tube than it is in the large diameter tube. Our first sample is water on wax paper. Our second sample is isopropanol. And our third sample is vegetable oil. In this station, we're looking at the evaporation rate of water, and we are comparing that to isopropyl alcohol. So you'll notice as we zoom in here, that's what our water line looks like, and here is our isopropyl alcohol. So even though I'm not timing these, we can watch this long enough in order to see what evaporates first. And there you can already see that isopropyl alcohol is evaporating very quickly. So it is almost completely gone. And then if we compare that to the water, we still see that full line of water on the table, and it has not evaporated at all. So clearly the difference here is that the isopropyl alcohol, or isopropanol, evaporates much faster than water. In this station, we're going to see what happens when we place a piece of solid vegetable oil, which is just frozen olive oil, into this beaker of liquid oil. And you will notice that immediately sank to the bottom of the beaker. So the solid oil will sink when placed in liquid oil. Now we're going to do the same thing with solid water, which is just obviously ice. You can see I've got some ice here in my hand, and when we place the ice in the liquid water, you can see that ice is floating on the surface. So in contrast, when we put solid water in liquid water, the solid is going to float. Whereas when we put solid oil in liquid oil, that solid oil would sink to the bottom. The first thing that we're doing at this station is watching how these water molecules interact with each other. So as you can see, they have an attraction for each other, and notice that it's always the hydrogen portion of one water molecule that is attracted to the oxygen of the other water molecule. Oxygen is shown in red and the two hydrogens are shown in white. That's the standard color for all of the models that we're looking at this station. Red for oxygen, white for hydrogen, and carbon is shown in black. So these water molecules, when they interact with sodium chloride, which is what we see here, this represents salt, like just table salt, regular old NaCl sodium chloride. And this dissolves in water because the water molecules actually surround that salt, and notice how it's stuck together in a very specific way. That oxygen was attracted to this blue part of the sodium chloride, and if we look at the other part of the sodium chloride, we see the hydrogen is attracted to it. So that's telling us something about the charges of those molecules. Now what water will do, it will actually pull those two molecules apart. Those two atoms, the sodium and the chloride, are now separated, and that represents being dissolved. So these other water molecules are going to come in and surround on all sides that separated ion of salt. Same thing over here. Notice that it's always the hydrogen, which remember has a slightly positive charge, attracting to this green one. So that should be enough for you to figure out which is sodium and which is chloride, because remember, sodium has a +1 charge and chloride has a -1 charge. So look at how the oxygen and hydrogen interacts and use that to figure out which color is sodium and which is chloride. The other molecule we're looking at here, if we move those out of the way, is now a molecule of glucose. Again, we're using that same color scheme. So these white parts are the hydrogen atoms, the red represents oxygen, and the black represents carbon. So notice that in this molecule, there are several red oxygens that are covalently bonded to the white hydrogen. Here's another one. If we rotate the molecule, here's another one. Here's another one over here. So all of those oxygen and hydrogen bonds are going to be polar covalent bonds, just like in our water molecule. So even though this isn't magnetic, it would behave the same way as a water molecule if it had magnets, where the hydrogen of the water would attract to the oxygen of the glucose, and the hydrogen of the glucose attracts to the oxygen of the water. So just like this is a polar covalent bond here in water, this is also a polar covalent bond between oxygen and hydrogen in a glucose molecule. So notice how many of those OH bonds you see, and now knowing what you know about the polarity of those bonds, you should be able to predict whether or not glucose is soluble in water. At our final station, station 6, we still have these water models that we're looking at, and you are asked initially at the station just to press all those molecules close together and see what happens. And it should come as no surprise to you at this point that we have the hydrogen of one water molecule, which is partially positive, attracting to the oxygen of a separate water molecule because that's partially negative. And that attraction holds them together. So this is what we would expect for a bunch of water molecules that are all close to each other. Now the other thing you're looking at here is a model of ethanol. Ethanol has two carbons. Those gray spheres are carbon, and they do have hydrogens attached to them, but then there's also a portion of the molecule that is an oxygen with hydrogen attached. So what you are asked to do at this station is to figure out how a water molecule would interact with ethanol. So we can start out with this red oxygen and its bonded hydrogen. And as you can imagine, the hydrogen of water is attracted to that oxygen on the ethanol. Same thing for the other side, and then this hydrogen on the ethanol would be attracted to the oxygen of a water molecule. All of this makes sense because this is essentially just 2/3 of a water molecule, and so we would expect it to behave in the same way as other water molecules. What we really need to look at here is the carbon and hydrogen portion of this molecule. So if I take the partially negatively charged oxygen and try to stick it to one of these hydrogens, there's no attraction there whatsoever. So you can see there's nothing sticking together. And if I try to flip this around and see if that hydrogen is attracted to the oxygen, we've got nothing. Nothing is attracted anywhere to a carbon or to a hydrogen. So what that tells us is that water is not going to interact with this portion of the molecule, but the oxygen portion of the molecule, there is an interaction. So this is a good example of a molecule where part of it is polar, this part right here, but then this part is nonpolar, where you have the carbon-hydrogen bonds. Remember, carbon-hydrogen bonds are always nonpolar, and that's why the water is not attracted to that portion of the molecule.